Part 1. Industrial America and the Need for Order. Industrial time changes play. For most of American history, sport did not exist inside a schedule. It existed inside life itself. Games were played when work was finished, when daylight allowed, and when the community felt ready. Rules were flexible because they had to be. Length was negotiable because time was not measured in hours, but in seasons, weather, and physical endurance. In agrarian America, this was not disorder. It was alignment. Labor followed natural cycles, and recreation followed labor. In that world, sport did not need a fixed beginning or a defined end. A contest might last until exhaustion, until darkness, or until agreement replaced argument. The absence of clocks did not weaken competition. It defined it. Play was elastic because life was elastic. That relationship between time and play began to fracture in the mid-19th century. As industrialization spread across the United States, time itself was reorganized. Factories did more than change how Americans worked. They changed when Americans lived. Bells and whistles replaced sunrise. Clocks replaced instinct. Shifts replaced seasons. Large numbers of people were now required to begin and end labor at the exact same moment, day after day, regardless of weather, health, or personal circumstance. This transformation reached far beyond the factory floor. Leisure time, once fluid, became compressed. Recreation was pushed into narrow, predictable windows, evenings after long shifts, Sundays, and occasional full days off. These windows were not flexible. They were limits. If an activity could not begin and end within them, it ceased to be practical. Sport faced a quiet but unavoidable choice. It could adapt to industrial time, or it could disappear. The informal contests of earlier America struggled under this new pressure. Games that drifted, arguments that lingered, and outcomes resolved by consensus rather than clarity, all consumed time workers no longer had. What had once been tolerable became frustrating. What had once been tradition became inefficiency. Structure did not emerge because Americans suddenly preferred order. It emerged because disorder no longer fit. Rules hardened. Boundaries became fixed. Scoring systems grew precise. The goal was no longer simply fairness. It was predictability. A game needed to start when expected. It needed to proceed without prolonged dispute. It needed to end when promised, regardless of unresolved emotion or leftover energy. The clock entered sport quietly, but it never left. This shift altered how people understood play itself. Recreation was no longer something that expanded naturally when work allowed. It became something planned, anticipated, and rationed. Sport turned into an event rather than an activity, something to attend rather than something to wander into. Urbanization intensified this transformation. As cities grew denser, open land shrank. Informal games that once spread across commons and fields now interfered with traffic, housing, and commerce. Organized sport offered a solution. Designated spaces reduced conflict. Scheduled times reduced uncertainty. Shared expectations replaced negotiation. Time and space became linked. Fields were reserved. Games were announced in advance. Participation required punctuality. Spectators arrived knowing when events would begin and when they would end. The clock no longer merely measured sport. It shaped it. Even the pace of play adjusted. Faster contests fit better into industrial life. Structured pauses replaced spontaneous breaks. The idea that a game should conclude within a reasonable and predictable duration became widely accepted, not because it was more exciting, but because it preserved access. Resistance to this change existed. Older generations remembered a world where games ended only when exhaustion or agreement intervened. To them, rigid scheduling felt artificial, even intrusive. But younger players, raised under factory whistles and school bells, accepted time discipline as natural. Structure was not a loss. It was simply how the world worked. Gradually, industrial time reshaped the meaning of sport. Winning became something that occurred within limits. Competition became something that fit a schedule. Recreation became something planned rather than spontaneous. These changes laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Leagues, seasons, standings, and championships all depend on the assumption that time is shared, measured, and enforced. Without industrial time, modern sport could not exist. The clock made comparison possible. It allowed games to be repeated under similar conditions. It created expectations for players and spectators alike. Most importantly, it made sport compatible with modern life. In doing so, it ensured that games would not fade under the pressure of industrial society, but evolve alongside it. This was the first step toward modern American sport, not the creation of leagues or professional teams, but the quiet, irreversible decision to let the clock decide when play would begin and when it would end. Cities force organization. Industrial time changed when Americans played. Cities changed how they played. As the 19th century progressed, American cities grew at a pace never before experienced. Industrial work pulled people inward, concentrating labor, housing, and daily life into dense urban environments. What had once been dispersed across fields, commons, and open land was now compressed into streets, lots, and shared spaces. This transformation did not simply alter where sport occurred. It altered whether informal sport could survive at all. In rural settings, space absorbed conflict. A game that drifted too far or lasted too long inconvenienced few people. In cities, space punished disorder. Crowded streets, growing traffic, and competing land uses meant that informal play increasingly interfered with everyday life. Games spilled into walkways. Spectators blocked commerce. Arguments halted movement. What had once been tolerated became disruptive. Urban density turned flexibility into friction. As populations grew, so did the frequency of competition. More people meant more players, more spectators, and more rivalries. Informal rules that depended on shared understanding collapsed under scale. When participants no longer knew one another personally, trust weakened. Disputes multiplied. Without agreed-upon authority, conflicts lingered. Cities exposed a simple truth. Sport without structure could not scale. Municipal governments and property owners quickly recognized this problem. Unregulated play threatened order, commerce, and safety. The response was not to eliminate sport, but to contain it. Designated spaces emerged. Fields were marked. Times were assigned. The city itself began to dictate when and where play was acceptable. This was a critical shift. Sport moved from being a spontaneous activity to a regulated presence within urban life. Permission mattered. Location mattered. Time mattered. Play was no longer free simply because participants desired it. It required alignment with civic order. Organization was not imposed from above alone. Players themselves recognized the need. Repeated disputes made informal agreement inefficient. Games ruined by argument wasted precious leisure time. In cities where workers had limited hours for recreation, a single unresolved conflict could invalidate an entire evening. Rules became tools of preservation. Written standards reduced debate. Fixed boundaries prevented encroachment. Defined roles limited confusion. Structure did not suppress competition. It protected it. Players began to accept that submitting to shared rules was preferable to losing play altogether. Urban sport began to mirror urban life. Just as cities relied on schedules, zoning, and authority to function, sport adopted similar mechanisms. Officials emerged not as celebrities, but as necessities. Their role was not to dominate play, but to resolve conflict quickly and decisively. Neutral judgment replaced peer negotiation. Spectators amplified the need for order. As cities concentrated populations, they also concentrated audiences. More people could watch games simply by proximity. This visibility raised stakes. Public disputes embarrassed teams and organizers alike. A chaotic contest undermined credibility. If sport was to exist publicly, it had to appear controlled. Order became part of the spectacle. Games that followed clear procedures invited trust. Spectators could invest emotionally when outcomes felt legitimate. Disorder alienated audiences. Organization attracted them. Urban sport also required predictability. Spectators planned attendance around work schedules. Uncertain start times discouraged engagement. Cities conditioned people to expect coordination. Sport adapted accordingly. Announced schedules replaced informal gathering. Reliability became a competitive advantage. Space reinforced hierarchy. In organized urban sport, not all participants were equal. Access to facilities required permission. Control of space conferred authority. Clubs, schools, and organizers gained influence by securing locations and times. Informal players lacking access were gradually excluded. This exclusion was not always deliberate, but it was inevitable. Urban organization favored those who could coordinate, communicate, and comply. Sport began to reward administrative capacity alongside athletic ability. The ability to organize games became as important as the ability to play them. Cities accelerated specialization. As sport became structured, roles multiplied. Players played. Officials officiated. Organizers scheduled. Groundskeepers maintained space. These divisions reflected the broader urban economy, where specialization replaced general participation. Sport became a system, not an activity. Conflict did not disappear, but it became contained. Arguments were redirected through officials. Disputes were resolved by reference to rules rather than reputation. The emotional intensity of competition remained, but it was bounded by procedure. This containment was essential for survival. Cities did not tolerate activities that resisted order. For sport to persist, it had to demonstrate compatibility with urban life. Organization was not optional, it was adaptive. By the late 19th century, this transformation was unmistakable. Informal urban play gave way to scheduled contests. Public spaces were regulated. Participation required adherence. Sport had learned how to exist within cities by becoming structured. The city did not kill play, it forced it to grow up. In doing so, urban life pushed sport toward its modern form. Organized, regulated, predictable, and public. What began as a response to crowding and conflict became a foundation. Without cities, sport might have remained local and informal. Within cities, it became scalable, visible, and durable. The pressure of urban density did what tradition alone could not. It made organization unavoidable. And once organization entered sport, it never left. Schools, clubs, and written rules. As cities forced sport to organize in space and time, schools and clubs forced it to organize in principle. The late 19th century saw the rapid expansion of institutions that valued repetition, comparison, and legitimacy. Schools, colleges, and private athletic clubs did not treat sport as casual recreation. They treated it as a tool for discipline, identity, and cohesion. To serve those purposes, play could no longer rely on memory or local custom. It needed permanence. That permanence arrived in writing. Educational institutions were among the first to demand consistency. When students competed across classes, campuses, or cities, informal agreement collapsed. What one group considered acceptable, another contested. For schools invested in fairness and reputation, this uncertainty was unacceptable. Rules had to be fixed, documented, and shared. Written rules solved a problem that oral tradition could not. They allowed contests to be repeated under similar conditions. They allowed disputes to be settled by reference rather than argument. They allowed authority to exist beyond the individuals present. Once rules were written, they could outlast players, seasons, and even institutions. Clubs extended this logic into civic life. Athletic clubs offered structure where cities offered pressure. Membership replaced casual participation. Eligibility replaced openness. Training replaced spontaneity. Clubs did not merely host games, they curated them. They set standards for conduct, attendance, and performance. Written rules were central to that control. Rules became a boundary. They determined who could play, how play unfolded, and how outcomes were decided. They also created exclusion. Those who did not know the rules, could not follow them, or could not access rule-governed spaces were pushed aside. This was not always malicious, but it was decisive. Organization began to separate participants from spectators. Schools and clubs also normalized repetition. Teams practiced the same activities under the same conditions, week after week. This repetition demanded clarity. Ambiguity disrupted training. Written rules stabilized preparation. Players could focus on execution rather than negotiation. Sport began to resemble curriculum. Just as classrooms followed syllabi, athletic programs followed rule books. Improvement was measured against fixed standards. Performance could be evaluated because conditions were known in advance. This shift altered the nature of competition. Winning was no longer simply about outlasting or overpowering an opponent. It was about mastery within constraints. Strategy emerged where improvisation once dominated. Planning mattered because the environment was predictable. Written rules also enabled travel. When teams moved between cities or institutions, rules traveled with them. A game could occur between strangers because expectations were shared. This portability transformed sport from local activity to regional practice. Without written standards, expansion would have stalled. Clubs and schools became anchors of legitimacy. Their endorsement of rules signaled seriousness. A contest governed by written standards appeared credible. This credibility attracted spectators, participants, and eventually sponsors. Organization produced trust. Authority followed structure. Once rules existed, someone had to interpret and enforce them. Officials emerged as neutral arbiters, often drawn from institutions rather than teams. Their authority derived not from personal reputation, but from their relationship to the rules themselves. This separation mattered. It removed conflict from players and placed it into process. Disputes were no longer personal affronts. They were procedural questions. Sport became less volatile and more sustainable. Written rules also created memory. They allowed records to exist. Achievements could be compared across time. History became measurable. Sport gained continuity, not just through storytelling, but through documentation. As schools and clubs spread these practices, they normalized them. What began as institutional necessity became cultural expectation. Participants learned to accept rules not as impositions, but as conditions of play. By the end of the 19th century, the idea that a serious sport required written rules was unquestioned. Informal play still existed, but it no longer defined legitimacy. The center of sport had shifted. Authority lived on paper. Identity lived in institutions. Competition lived within systems. Schools and clubs did not invent modern sport on their own, but they provided its framework. They turned play into practice, contests into programs, and rules into foundations. Once written rules governed sport, there was no return to pure informality. Sport had learned how to preserve itself. Authority enters the game. Once time, space, and rules reshaped sport, authority became unavoidable. In earlier forms of play, authority was temporary and personal. Disputes were settled by reputation, age, strength, or consensus. If agreement could not be reached, the game often dissolved. This worked when competition was small, local, and informal. It failed once sport became scheduled, public, and repeatable. Industrial society did not tolerate unresolved conflict. As sport adapted to industrial time, urban space, and written rules, it faced a new problem: enforcement. Rules without authority were suggestions. Suggestions invited argument. Argument wasted time and undermined credibility. For organized sport to function, someone had to decide, and their decision had to stand. Authority entered sport not as dominance, but as necessity. The emergence of officials marked a turning point. These figures were not initially celebrated or even welcomed. They were tolerated because they solved a problem players could no longer solve themselves. By removing disputes from the competitors, officials preserved the game. This separation mattered deeply. Once authority was external, competition could proceed without constant renegotiation. Players no longer needed to agree on every call. They only needed to accept the process. The legitimacy of sport shifted away from personal honor and toward institutional trust. Authority was not neutral by default. It had to be constructed. Officials derived power from rules, but rules alone were insufficient. Authority depended on consistency, visibility, and backing. An official whose decisions were ignored was worse than none at all. To function, authority had to be recognized before competition began. This recognition often came from institutions. Schools, clubs, and organizers appointed officials and enforced their legitimacy. By doing so, they embedded authority into the structure of sport. Disputes no longer threatened the continuation of play because authority existed beyond individual games. Sport became governable. This governance altered behavior. Players adjusted not only to rules, but to oversight. Conduct became regulated. Penalties replaced retaliation. Consequences replaced confrontation. Emotional intensity remained, but it was channeled. Authority also standardized experience. With enforcement came expectation. Players could anticipate how rules would be applied. Spectators could trust outcomes. Consistency created credibility, and credibility attracted attention. Public sport demanded authority most of all. As audiences grew, disorder became unacceptable. Spectators did not merely watch competition, they judged it. A chaotic contest undermined confidence. Authority reassured viewers that outcomes were legitimate, not arbitrary. The presence of officials also protected participants. By controlling escalation, authority reduced violence and prolonged disputes. This made sports safer, more sustainable, and more compatible with public life. Cities and institutions were more willing to host competitions that demonstrated control. Authority reshaped identity within sport. Players became participants within a system rather than autonomous actors. Compliance became part of skill. Understanding rules and respecting enforcement became competitive advantages. This transformation was cultural, not just procedural. Americans increasingly accepted authority in daily life, in factories, schools, and government. Sport mirrored this acceptance. Resistance persisted, but it diminished as benefits became clear. Authority also created hierarchy. Not all voices mattered equally. Decisions flowed from officials, not players. This hierarchy was essential for scale. Without it, sport could not function across cities, institutions, or regions. Once authority entered the game, informality receded. Sport did not lose its competitive edge, but it lost its improvisational core. What replaced it was durability. Games could be scheduled. Seasons could be planned. Outcomes could be recorded. Authority made permanence possible. By the end of the 19th century, the idea that sport required officials was unquestioned. Authority had become invisible, noticed only when challenged, missed only when absent. Sport had completed its first transformation. It now operated within time, space, rules, and authority. What remained was to expand, to grow beyond local institutions and become a system capable of national reach. That expansion would change everything. Part 2. Sport becomes a system. Leagues replace informal competition. By the late 19th century, sport had learned how to survive. What it had not yet learned was how to scale. Organization within cities, schools, and clubs created order, but it also revealed a new limitation. Structured games still depended on local arrangements. Schedules conflicted. Rules varied by institution. Outcomes mattered only within narrow circles. For sport to expand beyond its immediate environment, it required a higher level of coordination, one that no single team or club could provide. Leagues emerged to solve that problem. A league did not merely group teams together. It imposed continuity. It transformed isolated contests into seasons, isolated rivals into standings, and isolated victories into narratives that unfolded over time. This shift altered the meaning of competition itself. Before leagues, games were endpoints. After leagues, games became data points. Informal competition had always struggled with reliability. Teams appeared and disappeared. Commitments were fluid. Rematches were uncertain. Leagues replaced uncertainty with obligation. Membership carried expectations. Schedules were fixed in advance. Withdrawal carried consequences. This stability changed behavior. Teams now prepared for seasons rather than singular contests. Strategy expanded beyond individual games to encompass endurance, consistency, and long-term planning. Winning once mattered less than winning repeatedly under the same conditions. Leagues introduced shared authority. Rules no longer belonged solely to clubs or schools. They were standardized across all participants. Enforcement was centralized. Disputes were resolved at the league level, not the field. This removed power from individual competitors and placed it within the system itself. Authority became impersonal. This impersonality was critical. Decisions no longer depended on local reputation or immediate pressure. They were made according to procedure. This made outcomes defensible, even when unpopular. Trust shifted away from individuals and toward structures. Leagues also synchronized time. Games occurred according to shared calendars. Seasons aligned across cities. Predictability allowed spectators to plan, newspapers to publish, and institutions to invest. Sport began to operate on a national rhythm rather than a local one. This synchronization amplified attention. When teams competed within a league, their performances became comparable. Records accumulated, standings evolved. Progress could be tracked. Fans did not merely watch games, they followed seasons. Narrative replaced novelty. Leagues turned sport into an ongoing story. Each contest mattered because it affected the whole. Anticipation built across weeks and months. Losses carried consequences beyond disappointment. Wins carried meaning beyond celebration. This continuity deepened attachment. Spectators identified with teams not just in moments of victory, but through sustained participation. Loyalty emerged from shared endurance. The system rewarded attention over time. Leagues also imposed discipline on participants. Membership required compliance. Teams that violated rules threatened the integrity of the system. Enforcement became collective rather than local. This discouraged manipulation and encouraged conformity. Uniformity was not accidental. It was the point. Standardized rules ensured that competition remained comparable across contexts. Without uniformity, standings lost meaning. With it, performance became measurable. Leagues created infrastructure. They required scheduling offices, rule committees, and enforcement mechanisms. Administration became inseparable from competition. Sport now depended as much on coordination as on athleticism. This dependence altered power dynamics. Control shifted away from players and toward organizers. Decisions about schedules, locations, and eligibility shaped outcomes as much as performance. Sport became something that could be managed. Leagues also facilitated expansion. New teams could join existing structures rather than negotiating from scratch. Travel became feasible because expectations were shared. Competition crossed regional boundaries without collapsing under disagreement. Scale followed structure. As leagues stabilized, sport attracted broader audiences. Newspapers could cover standings consistently. Spectators could follow distant teams. Public interest grew not because individual games were more dramatic, but because the system made meaning cumulative. Leagues transformed loss. In informal play, defeat ended the story. In leagues, defeat redirected it. Teams adjusted. Fans recalibrated expectations. The season continued. Resilience replaced fragility. This resilience made sport durable. It could withstand setbacks without dissolving. Continuity protected investment, from time, from attention, and eventually from money. Leagues did not eliminate local identity, they amplified it. Teams represented cities, schools, or regions within a shared framework. Rivalries intensified because they were repeated under comparable conditions. Conflict became structured rather than chaotic. Order did not suppress passion. It organized it. By replacing informal competition with league systems, sport crossed a threshold. It moved from participation to production, from recreation to institution, from events to seasons. Once leagues governed competition, sport no longer depended on circumstance. It depended on systems. And systems, once built, seek growth. Sport becomes a system. Media, spectators, and scale leagues created structure. Media gave that structure reach. Once sport adopted seasons, schedules, and standings, it became something that could be followed rather than merely attended. This shift mattered more than any single innovation. Sport no longer depended on physical presence. It could now exist in the imagination of people who were not there. Print media made that possible. In the late 19th century, newspapers expanded alongside cities and leagues. Daily circulation grew. Literacy increased. The public developed an appetite for regular information. Sport fit neatly into this emerging rhythm. Results could be reported. Standings could be tracked. Anticipation could be cultivated. Games began to matter beyond the field. Box scores, summaries, and recaps transformed competition into data. Performance was reduced to numbers, outcomes, and comparisons. This abstraction allowed sport to travel. A reader could understand a contest without witnessing it. Distance no longer excluded participation. Media standardized attention. By reporting games consistently, newspapers reinforced league authority. What was printed became official. Disputes were settled not just by officials, but by record. Memory shifted from oral retelling to documented result. This documentation created permanence. Sport acquired a past that could be referenced. Achievements accumulated. Failure lingered. Reputation extended across time rather than resetting with each contest. Media did not merely describe sport, it preserved it. Spectatorship changed as a result. Before leagues and media, audiences were incidental. They gathered because games happened nearby. With coverage, spectators became followers. They tracked teams across weeks and seasons. Emotional investment deepened because outcomes accumulated. Attachment replaced novelty. Spectators no longer attended games solely for entertainment. They attended to confirm expectations formed elsewhere. Media shaped anticipation. The experience of sport began before arrival and continued after departure. This extended engagement altered the economics of sport. As audiences grew, attention acquired value. Larger crowds justified larger venues. Consistent coverage justified investment. Sport began to generate predictable returns, not because individual games were profitable, but because the system sustained interest. Scale became possible. Media allowed leagues to reach beyond local populations. A team could acquire supporters who never attended a match. Identity extended outward. Cities projected themselves through sport. This projection reinforced loyalty. Spectators came to see teams as representatives. Wins affirmed collective pride. Losses wounded it. Sport offered a shared emotional language that transcended class and occupation. Media amplified this effect. By framing competition as narrative, newspapers turned seasons into stories. Rivalries were contextualized, stakes were explained, sport became legible to casual followers. This legibility mattered. It lowered the barrier to entry. One did not need deep knowledge to care. Standings told the story. Records summarized performance. Media created shortcuts to understanding. Scale followed accessibility. As attention broadened, sport adjusted to accommodate it. Scheduling considered spectators. Venues emphasized visibility. The experience of watching became as important as the act of playing. Spectators were no longer passive. Their presence influenced behavior. Order mattered because disorder alienated audiences. Legitimacy mattered because trust sustained interest. Sport increasingly operated with the spectator in mind. Media also enforced conformity. Coverage rewarded predictability. Leagues that maintained order received attention. Those that fractured lost it. Public visibility became a form of discipline. This pressure stabilized systems. Leagues that survived did so by aligning with media rhythms. Regular schedules, clear standings, and consistent rules facilitated coverage. In return, coverage reinforced their authority. Mutual dependence emerged. Sport needed media to scale. Media needed sport to fill space. This relationship accelerated growth. What had once been recreation became content. Spectatorship reshaped identity within sport. Players became performers within a system observed by many. Their actions carried symbolic weight. Mistakes were remembered. Success was amplified. This visibility intensified competition. Performance mattered not only for outcome, but for perception. Reputation became an asset. Consistency became valuable. Sport began to reward reliability alongside excellence. Scale also introduced distance. Spectators who followed teams through media experienced sport differently than those present. Their engagement was less sensory and more narrative. This abstraction further separated sport from its informal origins. Yet this separation strengthened durability. By existing in print and memory, sport outlasted individual events. It became part of daily life. Headlines integrated competition into routine. By the end of the 19th century, sport had achieved something unprecedented. It could be played locally, governed centrally, and followed nationally. Media made this possible by extending attention beyond physical limits. Sport had learned how to occupy space, time, and now imagination. With scale achieved, the system was ready for its next transformation. Money would soon follow attention. Sport becomes a system. Paying players changes everything. Attention created value. Value demanded labor. Labor demanded payment. Once leagues stabilized competition and media expanded audiences, sport crossed a line it could not uncross. What had been recreation, then institution, now became work. The change was not announced. It emerged quietly through necessity, pressure, and opportunity. As spectatorship grew, so did expectations. Fans expected teams to appear consistently, to compete seriously, and to improve over time. These expectations required commitment. Commitment required time. Time conflicted with other labor. The more sport demanded reliability, the less compatible it became with unpaid participation. Payment entered sport as a solution, not a corruption. Early compensation was often informal. Travel expenses were covered, wages were replaced, incentives were offered quietly. These arrangements were justified as practical accommodations rather than salaries. But function mattered more than language. Once players received money to prioritize sport, the relationship changed. Sport became labor. This shift redefined participation. Playing was no longer something done after work. It became the work itself. Training intensified, preparation extended, performance expectations rose. The system demanded reliability, and payment enforced it. Payment also introduced hierarchy. Not all players were compensated equally. Skill acquired price. Consistency acquired value. Availability acquired premium. Teams invested in talent because outcomes now affected revenue, reputation, and standing. This investment altered competition. Teams no longer relied solely on local participants. They sought advantage through recruitment. Loyalty shifted from community to contract. Movement increased. Stability decreased. The system incentivized performance. Winning mattered more when it affected income. Loss carried cost beyond disappointment. Pressure intensified. The emotional stakes of competition rose alongside financial ones. Payment also exposed contradictions. Many institutions resisted professionalism publicly while tolerating it privately. amateur ideals persisted in rhetoric even as compensation spread in practice. This tension reflected cultural discomfort. Americans valued merit and labor, but they also valued the appearance of purity. The contradiction was unsustainable. Once payment became necessary for scale, denial became inefficient. Enforcement of amateurism required surveillance and punishment. Tolerance of professionalism required acknowledgement. Systems eventually choose efficiency. Payment also formalized authority. Contracts replaced informal agreement. Obligations became explicit. Disputes moved from personal conflict to administrative resolution. Sport adopted mechanisms common to other industries. This adoption deepened institutional control. Leagues regulated eligibility. Teams managed payrolls. Players negotiated terms. Power shifted toward organizations capable of coordination and capital. Labor relations emerged. Players gained leverage through scarcity and performance, but they also faced vulnerability. Injury, replacement, and exclusion carried consequences. Sport now mirrored the broader economy, with risk unevenly distributed. Payment changed public perception. Spectators adjusted their expectations. Paid players were judged differently. Excellence was demanded. Effort was scrutinized. Failure invited criticism. Professionalism raised standards. The idea that sport should be played for love alone weakened as spectators recognized the demands placed on participants. Payment legitimized those demands. Payment also intensified inequality. Teams with greater resources gained advantage. Facilities improved unevenly. Talent clustered. Competitive balance became a concern rather than an assumption. This concern prompted regulation. Leagues experimented with rules to preserve fairness. Caps, eligibility requirements, and revenue sharing emerged later as responses to financial disparity. The system learned that money, left unchecked, distorted competition. Yet money was indispensable. Without compensation, scale would collapse. Without scale, attention would fragment. Payment anchored the system. Payment also professionalized identity. Players became specialists, careers emerged, training methods standardized, sport separated from casual life and became a distinct occupation. This separation altered culture. Communities still identified with teams, but players were no longer neighbors. Distance increased. Spectators related to sport through representation rather than participation. This distance strengthened narrative. Heroes emerged. Villains formed. Careers could be followed. Media amplified these arcs. Sport became story-driven not only by results, but by livelihoods. Payment also demanded accountability. Organizations tracked performance. Statistics gained importance. Evaluation became continuous. The system required measurement to justify investment. Measurement reinforced standardization. Rules, schedules, and enforcement mattered more when outcomes affected finances. Disorder became costly. Stability became valuable. Professionalism stabilized sport by binding it to economic reality. It ensured that participants could meet demands consistently. It justified infrastructure. It attracted investment. But it also ended something. Sport could no longer pretend to be separate from society. It reflected inequality, negotiation, and power. The system absorbed these dynamics and carried them forward. By paying players, sport completed its transformation from pastime to industry. Once labor entered the equation, sport was no longer just played. It was produced. The modern sports framework is set by the end of the 19th century. Sport had crossed its final threshold. Time had been standardized. Space had been regulated. Rules had been written. Authority had been accepted. Leagues had imposed continuity. Media had extended attention. Payment had transformed participation into labor. What remained was not invention, but alignment. Sport had become a system. This system did not depend on any single component. It functioned because its parts reinforced one another. Remove the clock, and schedules collapsed. Remove authority, and legitimacy eroded. Remove media, and scale disappeared. Remove payment, and reliability failed. Modern sport endured because each element supported the rest. Stability replaced improvisation. Games no longer relied on circumstance. They occurred because structures demanded they occur. Seasons advanced regardless of individual outcomes. Competition became durable rather than fragile. This durability altered expectations. Spectators no longer wondered whether games would happen. They assumed they would. Attention shifted from uncertainty to performance. Trust in the system allowed emotional investment to deepen. Institutions solidified control. Leagues refined governance. Committees standardized rules. Procedures replaced negotiation. Decisions flowed through channels rather than personalities. Authority became embedded rather than visible. This invisibility was a sign of success. When systems function smoothly, they disappear into routine. Sport became predictable enough to fade into daily life. Schedules aligned with work. Coverage aligned with media cycles. Attendance aligned with habit. Sport became cultural infrastructure. It did not require explanation. It required participation. Even those who did not attend games recognized their significance. Results mattered because they were shared, not because they were surprising. The framework also normalized hierarchy. Players occupied defined roles. Officials enforced boundaries. Administrators coordinated operations. Spectators consumed outcomes. Each role depended on the others. Mobility existed, but structure limited it. This hierarchy enabled scale. As sport expanded, coordination replaced consensus. Decisions could be made without universal agreement. Efficiency outweighed inclusivity. The framework also standardized memory. Records accumulated. Statistics stabilized comparison. History became measurable rather than anecdotal. Achievement could be ranked across time. This measurement shaped ambition. Players pursued benchmarks. Teams pursued titles. Leagues pursued legitimacy. Goals were defined by the system itself. Modern sport also separated production from consumption. Most people no longer played at the level they watched. Participation and spectatorship diverged. Sport became something many experienced indirectly. This separation increased symbolic power. Teams represented cities. Outcomes represented identity. Victory and loss carried meaning beyond the field. Sport offered a language for collective emotion. The framework also constrained change. Once systems harden, alteration becomes difficult. Tradition gains authority. Innovation faces resistance. Stability protects investment. This resistance was not accidental. Sport had become valuable. Value demanded protection. The framework ensured continuity even as participants changed. By the turn of the 20th century, the core architecture of modern sport was complete. What followed would be expansion, specialization, and conflict, but not reinvention. The fundamental shape was set. Modern sport would grow louder, faster, and richer. It would face challenges and adaptations, but it would do so within the boundaries established during this period. The transformation was irreversible. Sport was no longer casual, local, or negotiable. It was scheduled, governed, and sustained. It belonged to institutions as much as to participants. This was the final consequence of time taking control. Once sport became a system, it could outlive generations. And systems, once built, define what follows.